Hello, and welcome to the Rare Breeding Birds Panel Conference to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the panel. I'm Dawn Bulmer, Chair of a Rare Breeding Bird Panel, and I represent BTO on the panel. It's fantastic to bring together great speakers this evening and tomorrow night, and I very much hope you enjoy the evening. We're using the webinar format. This means the meeting is going to be recorded, and we hope to place it on YouTube. All the talks are pre-recorded, but there will be a live question and answer session at the end of each talk. Please use the Q&A button to type in questions during the talks. And you can also use the like button to upvote questions so they move higher up the order. So everyone is muted on this call. You can also use the chat function for general comments only, but note we're only using the Q&A button for questions, so we won't be monitoring the chat. We'll have a 10-minute break at 8:05, and we hope to end the conference by 9:20. I'll leave the introduction of the work of the panel to the panel secretary, Mark Eaton, who will be giving the first talk this evening. So Mark was appointed panel secretary in April 2020, having been a panel member since 2007 and chair since 2012. He worked for the RSBB from 2001 and was principal conservation scientist in the monitoring section before leaving in the autumn of 2021 to take up the role as a panel secretary, alongside some independent ornithological and conservation work. Mark has been doing a fantastic job as secretary, and his talk this evening will explain what the panel does. So welcome, Mark, and over to you.
Hello, I'm Mark Eaton. I have the privilege of being the secretary of the Rare Breeding Birds panel, and it's my role tonight to provide a bit of background into who the RBBP are, what we do and how we do it. That does mean that, with apologies, I'm not going to talk about the actual birds very much, so I've scattered various photos such as this Balon's crake through the talk to keep you entertained. I'll start with the introduction to the RBBP and a little history. You'll have gathered we're celebrating our 50th birthday, though there are a number of dates we could have picked for this. In 1968, the RSBB's council formed a subcommittee to compile data on the rare breeding birds, particularly due to the data coming from the first breeding bird atlas, the Sharrock Atlas, between 68 and 72. In late 72, it was decided this subcommittee should evolve to an organisation independent of the RSBB, the Rare Breeding Birds Panel. This met with the support of the Nature Conservancy Council, the UK government agency for conservation at the time, the BTO, and the journal British Birds, and hence the first meeting of the panel was held in April 1973. The first report, published in 1975, covered 1973. Looking back, it included totals of just 16 singing Chetty's warblers, of course no little egrets. On the other hand, there were over 40 pairs of redback shrikes, and no one could even dreamt of turtledove being regarded as a rare breeding bird back then. Here's me in the mid-70s, and as you can probably tell, although I was showing an interest in birds, I wasn't involved in the panel at the time. And although some of my colleagues are longer in the tooth than me, none of them were involved back at the start. So we should really pay tribute to those who've come before us, establishing and then developing the panel over half a century. And I'm pleased that some of our members are joining the conference tonight, the previous members. Basically, the RBBP is a small group of experts bringing knowledge and experience on a complementary range of aspects around rare breeding birds and their recording. Some of the panels serve to represent the interests of the funding organisations, the RSBB, the Joint Nature Conservation Committee, who act on behalf of the conservation bodies for all of the 4 UK's countries, and the BTO, but most are independent panel members. I've listed here the 5 secretaries who've done the tasks of the panel over the 50 years, and then the chairs. You'll notice the progression towards equality. And here's all of the members. There's only 24 people served on the panel in 50 years. Turnover is slow. Sadly, 4 of those members have passed away. And here you can see the current panel. Funding of the panel's work, basically the part-time employment of the secretary, is split between the JNCC and RSBB, with an additional contribution towards costs from the BTO. So what do? We collate data on rare breeding birds in the UK. We maintain a secure archive of that data, dating back to 1973, and we make data available for bona fide conservation and research purposes under strict conditions. Obviously, the secure part of this archive is important, both to ensure that our data doesn't fall into the wrong hands and to ensure we have the confidence of those who provide the data in the first place. So we're very proud to say that in 50 years there's not been a single case of accidental or inappropriate release of data. We ourselves use that data to give updates on the status of rare breeding bird species and trends in that status, principally through our annual reports in British Birds. Due to time lags in data being collated and submitted, and then the work that we have to do, reports are published in the autumn 2 years after the breeding season in question. So the most recent report in November 22 in British Birds covered 2020. All our previous reports are available on our website, by the way. Before I go any further, I should clarify what a rare breeding bird is. So when the panel first started, it covered quite a restricted list of very rare species. Gradually the remit has grown, and now we define a rare breeding species as having any with a breeding population below 2,000 pairs in the UK. That's actually quite a high number, and it would be fair to describe some of the species we cover, such as avocet, little egret, shoveler, peregrine, as scarce rather than rare, in contrast to the great rarities such as purple sandpiper. Typically, we cover about 100 species a year in our reports, of which around 78 are regular breeding species. The other come from a long and slowly growing list of species which have only occasionally bred or have never actually bred in the UK but have shown breeding behaviour, often vagrant males trying to attract a mate, such as this elegant tern on Anglesey. Our last secretary, Mark Holling, will talk about some of the examples, the exciting examples of these rarer species in his talk tomorrow, so I won't step on his toes. Don't miss his talk. In total, 180 naturally occurring species or subspecies have been featured in the Rare Breeding Bird Panel reports, of which 52 have never actually been confirmed as breeding, although 13 have bred in hybrid pairs, such as this ring-billed gull. I should also point out we cover rare non-native breeding species, this case using a lower threshold of 300 pairs. And there'll be a new report on non-natives covering 2015 to 2020 out this year. So how do we work? The first thing to clarify is that we don't go out and collect all the data ourselves, apart from in our spare time, of course. We rely on others submitting the data to us, and equally importantly, those who are in the chain of data flows, who collate data on our behalf. So observers don't submit their records directly to us. By far the most important source of rare breeding bird data are the county and regional bird recorders, who are tasked with providing annual returns to the panel, reporting all records of species on our species list, displaying signs of breeding at a site-by-site level for their recording area. Sometimes this is done by another individual to the recorder or a team dedicated to this one, often time-consuming task. They use different systems for compiling data. Often nowadays online portals such as BirdTrack and eBird provide data to counties, but they also have bespoke systems. Nearly all recorders then submit data to the panel using our standardised spreadsheet, and in recent years about 65 to 70% of all the records we receive come through that county bird recorder network. Other important sources include data from raptor study groups, data submitted to statutory conservation bodies as a requirement of disturbance and photographic licences, data from the BTO and JNCC ringing and nest recording schemes, RBBP data from monitoring of reserves and from annual monitoring on programmes for targeted species recovery, for corncrake, for example. Data from the seabird monitoring programme for a few species such as little tern and Arctic skua. And then there's data from periodic species surveys such as those conducted under the Statutory Conservation Agency and RBBP annual breeding bird scheme, scarabs, and BTO surveys such as for peregrine as well as egret data submitted to the Heronries census. So all these numerous data flows are basically channeling data collected by ornithologists, those engaged in recreational bird watching, those doing more focused survey work, those ringing, and by professionals and volunteers working on species conservation and on reserves. To be honest, we've failed to quantify the number of people involved, but we know this is in the thousands. And we owe a huge debt of gratitude to all these people. A back-of-the-envelope calculation suggests that somewhere in the region of 85 or 90% of all the data comes from volunteers. And of course, we all also owe an immense debt to those in the chain of data, those who ensure those records are collated and submitted to us. So that's the professionals at the BTO, the RBBP, the country agencies, but also, it's the same as the observers really, a large number of volunteers, those county and regional recorders and those who assist them, who are responsible for our most significant data flow and do so providing their time and expertise freely. Once received, these data go into our database, a geographical information system with all records ascribed to a site. You probably realise that we receive multiple records for some species. For example, a Mediterranean gull colony in an RSBB reserve might be reported by the RSBB, by the county recorder, by the seabird monitoring programme, and maybe there might be nest record or ringing data as well. So in a recent year we receive about 9,000 records. Once we've removed all these duplicates, we're left with about 6,500 or 7,000 unique records. Again, in recent years that's covering about 25,000 pairs of rare breeding bird species across everything we cover. That's the point at which our data are archived, they're available for conservation and research purposes, and our annual reporting. And you'll hear from others about the use of our data, such as Dawn Balmer talking tomorrow. But I will mention a core part of my role, which is producing our annual reports, summarising all the records we receive in a given year. We do that species by species, giving data for each recording level. For very rare species, typically those with fewer than 30 pairs, we give details of individual breeding records. Of course, we don't talk about sites. Less rare species will have summary totals by county, often tabulated, as you can see here for Gargany. For each species, we summarise the status in the banner at the top of the account, which of our categories of scarcity it's in, the birds of conservation concern status, an assessment of how good our coverage is, and for regularly occurring species, a population estimate and a population trend derived from our data. So, we get lots of data, and we do good things with it. And as you'll hear about some of that from other speakers. But not all is perfect, as I'm sure you realise. And hence another significant part of what the panel does, and we're doing right now over these 2 evenings, is outreach to try and improve the data we receive. Talking, giving talks, social media, papers, our website. And we have lots of plans for this year, our anniversary year. Lots of communication to improve the monitoring and the recording of rare breeding birds in the UK. And we can group these into 2 main aims. Firstly, to improve the quality of data submitted by all these routes, to ensure the data is of good quality when it reaches us. So ensuring that observations have got good location data, preferably good references, getting counts, getting breeding evidence. There's nothing more frustrating than receiving records with poor location data or no information about what the birds were doing. Was there a singing male? Was there a nest? And so on. So we're promoting best practice in the reporting of rare breeding birds to help those who are then collating that data to pass on. We'll be publishing a new version of our short recording standards leaflet, a guide to recording rare breeding birds shortly. Not least as the cover species, as you can see, is no longer a rare breeding bird. We're making progress slowly. You can see here the proportion of records with grid references has slowly increased over time to around 90%. And our network is getting stronger. This figure shows the number of counties submitting data directly to us. And you can see in how most recent years we've received submissions from every recording area in the UK. The other key aim is simply to increase the amount of data we receive. I mentioned before the statements on data quality given in the species banners. And while we're keen to promote what we achieve and our value, we have to acknowledge that there are some shortfalls in what we're able to achieve. There are a number of species for which the RBBP's data, while still being useful, is not robust enough to monitor species trends. In some cases, such as long-eared owl, the data we receive annually might represent just 10% of the UK population. So without sounding too much like Donald Rumsfeld and talking about known unknowns and so forth, there's 2 types of shortfall. There's the rare breeding birds that are encountered by birdwatchers but not reported to us, and there's those that simply aren't observed. The former are perhaps the most frustrating group, but it's more tractable. Here our role is to get the message about the work we do and the value of it out, so everyone who sees and observes a rare breeding bird during the breeding season will realise the importance of that and the need to submit it and to give the right information so it's a quality record. The second problem is harder to tackle because it's about changing observer behaviour to get out there and find rare breeding birds that are being missed. We struggle to cover those species which are hard to find and collect data on, such as long-eared owl and lesser-spotted woodpeckers, which you'll hear about from Ken Smith tomorrow. Another issue is those that exceed local capacity to monitor them. There are some species which, while rare breeders, might be relatively abundant in some areas. Sow buntings in Devon, for example. We're better at monitoring the really rare species where there are fewer to find. But the biggest issue is those species which are primarily found in places where there are few birdwatchers. So those of the north and the west, of Scotland in particular, and of remote upland and montane habitats. Of the 10 species we assess as having low quality coverage, 8 of them are species with a northern distribution, such as red-breasted merganser, greenshank. This is a tough nut to crack. While we can encourage reporting, for example, making appeals to those that are visiting remote regions on birding holidays, it's always going to be difficult. We hope in years to come to be able to do more with the data we get, to adopt new analytical approaches that might allow us to address spatial and temporal variation in recording that will improve what we can do with the data we have got. Nonetheless, I think we can hold our heads up and be proud of what the RBBP has achieved over the last 50 years. Thanks to those who've worked on the panel and the great number of people who've supported our work, we're able to support conservation efforts for a wide range of rare species and do so efficiently and cost effectively. Of course, the financial cost massively underestimates the true effort that underpins our work, the contributions of unpaid volunteers in form of the birders, collecting the records, and the county bird recorders and others who collate the data. So I'd like to finish by, on behalf of the panel, firstly thanking our funders, the JCC, RBBP and BTO. Secondly, by thanking all those who work to collate data and provide annual submissions to the RBBP, as you underpin everything we do. I wish I had time to read this list out from our most recent report, but you'll hear us, every one of you. Thank you. And of course, I want to thank those of you who make observations and submit records of rare breeding birds in the first place. Now, spring is arriving. Goshawks are displaying, little ring plovers are returning from Africa. So please, get out there, do even more. Thank you for listening. Please enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you, Mark. That's a great talk and a really fantastic start to the conference. So we don't have any questions in the Q&A at the moment. So I was going to ask you, Mark, what you see as the highest priorities for the panel over the next couple of years.
Ooh, good question, Dawn. One I've not got an answer prepared for. You should have warned me. Yeah, it is a good question. I think at the moment, as you know, indeed, the audience doesn't know, we're working very hard on our database, improving the standard of the data held in our geographical information system, especially around the definition of sites that the place is attributed to. Working on a legacy of 50 years of sort of erroneous grid references and so forth. So I think the behind the scenes work there is very important because that will really move us to a point where we can do some much more exciting things in terms of analysis and output from with our data. So that's a priority. I think otherwise it's this continual push using the new ways we've got of reaching audiences, social media and so forth to try and improve our coverage and motivate people, hopefully some of the people in the audience today to try some new things, try and cover some of the species where we've struggled to get good coverage before now.
Yeah, perfect. I should have warned you, but yeah, we've talked a lot in our panel meetings about improving data quality, and obviously that in the future will then lead on to data sets available for research more readily. So that's good. I was also going to ask you about, you mentioned long-eared owl as being a very under-recorded species. Do you think that is the most under-recorded species, or are there other groups of birds that you think are really not well recorded? I mean, I was thinking ducks, for example.
There are one or two species for which our recording doesn't really do much at all, and all we can do is gather some sort of distribution data which will help when national surveys come along. So Wimborough, for example, which has been surveyed very recently and will have the results for very, very soon, the RBBP can't help to do something away from those national surveys. Dotterel would be another another example. And then there's quite a lot of species where we have maybe not brilliant monitoring, but enough that it's standardized between years. The level of effort is relatively stable, so we can track population change reasonably well, even though we know we're missing some of the data. And we do have, in fact, Ken tomorrow, I'm not going to give anything away about Ken Smith's talk, but he'll talk about some of the things we could do for lesser spotted woodpecker, and those sorts of modelling approaches that he'll talk about, statistical approaches, we could use more widely to help with some of those species where we've got considerable gaps.
Okay, yeah, perfect. Thanks, Mark. We've got a few questions coming in now. So Ray asks that with so many species coming rare, will panel be overwhelmed in years to come?
Hopefully not. And we've done quite a good job of giving ourselves a larger job over the years from the original panel with a much more restricted list. And to be honest, we've seen more species move off in recent years through increasing than have moved on. So although we've seen, say, turtle dove move on to the list, we've taken the likes of firecrest and Chetty's warbler and gadwall off, and we can see some others with, if the current rates of increase continue, they'll be leaving our list. So avocet and Mediterranean gull, if they can escape the ravages of bird flu, for example, we might expect those to move off. So at the moment, we're okay. Yes, a look ahead might suggest that there could be more wood warblers and so forth, and still some rapidly declining species out there. But yeah, I think we're keeping our heads above water at the moment.
Yeah, good, thanks. And Tom asks what are the biggest success stories are at a species level or more broadly?
Well, I think what we're seeing is quite a considerable number of species increasing as a response to conservation action. So we're seeing a lot of wetland birds, the cranes, egrets, and so forth, colonizing. Some of which is of course due to climate change, which is open to debate whether that should be regarded as a success. But we can see the pattern of conservation action, better safeguarding of sites both in the UK and across Europe, producing this pattern of expansion of species from Europe into the UK, and things doing quite well. So there's lots of success stories in our reports. I think there's about a dozen species which at the moment have been increasing, posting new record totals year on year for quite a long period. So yeah, there's good news. Okay.
We've got time for probably one or two more questions. So Pete asks, given the amount of survey work being undertaken in the north and west of Scotland, for example, around wind farms, I think he's probably talking about consultancies, it's surprising to hear about the lack of data for certain species. And do we have sight of some of that data that's surveys carried out under license, for example, from Nature Scot?
So it's yes, quite a long answer to that, and these things are quite complicated. But the answer is no, not everything is running as smoothly as we would like it to, and particularly with consultancy data collected for consultancy under contract, we're not getting a lot of that. So that's something another priority really, another thing we're keen to do is to improve relationships there and see whether we can get some of that data flowing. Because as you say, there's quite a lot going on. We know that for some species, for example, some of our wood sandpiper data in recent years, we've seen an increase in wood sandpiper reporting, which may reflect an increase in the population, but also probably reflects new pairs being found, new territories being found as a result of consultancy work. So some of it's reaching us, but quite a lot isn't, unfortunately.
Okay, and one very quick question. And what is the minimum evidence required to get a species onto our radar? Thinking about non-breeding but summering birds.
Well, I mean, our possible breeding categories are standard atlasing approach. So a bird present in suitable breeding habitat during the breeding season can be considered, it's H, actually Atlas code H, a bird in habitat. That is possible breeding. So it depends on the circumstances, particularly for a vagrant bird, a bird out of normal range, whether that could be considered suitable breeding habitat. For things really out of range, we probably want something more like singing behavior to suggest evidence of breeding. But for a regular breeding bird in the UK, if it's in potential breeding habitat during the breeding season, then that is at least a possible breeding.
Cool. Okay, well, thank you very much, Mark. There's a few
Pleasure.
more questions in Q&A, which we might be able to sort of type a few answers to as we go along. Cool. So the next talk is by Marcus Ward on hawfinch in the New Forest. Marcus is heavily involved in surveying, research and education on the biodiversity of the New Forest through long-running studies, and more recently, his directorship of the not-for-profit Wild New Forest. After documenting the increase in firecrest across the forest, Marcus has now developed a particular interest in hawfinches with recent work tracking the movements of birds, GPS and radio tags. So welcome to Marcus, and we look forward to your talk.
Hello, I'm Marcus Ward from Wild New Forest, and I'm going to talk to you this evening about hawfinches in the New Forest. Before we get going through the field work, I'm going to talk a little bit about background of hawfinch in the forest, or hawfinch in the UK, in fact. So this first slide here shows just the previous two BTO breeding bird atlases that have been published. The first there on the left in 1968 to 1972, by comparison to the recent one from 2008 to 2011. There you can see a clear reduction in numbers of breeding records across the UK between the two atlas periods. And notably, in the 2008 to 2011 survey, sort of concentrations of birds remaining there, particularly the New Forest, Forested Dean, North Wales and South Lakes. So on the back of this, the breeding bird atlas that was published in 2008 or 2011, the RSPB called a meeting to look at the situation with hawfinch in the UK, and so I attended that meeting back in, I can't remember when it was, 2011, 2012. And what became apparent was how little we sort of knew and understood about hawfinch in the UK. Particularly in my patch, which is the New Forest. It's a species that I've been around, that always seems to be around, but I hadn't really taken all that much notice of, just beyond logging the occasional nest and so on. And so it's prompted a lot of questions in my mind as to what's going on with hawfinch, and it was apparent that, as I said, that we didn't have a good understanding of hawfinch in the UK. So that's kind of the catalyst for me getting involved with hawfinch, yeah, just over 10 years ago now. So just a bit of context, the importance of the New Forest for hawfinch. So going back to previous population estimates in 1993, as you can see there, population estimate was 3,000 to 6,500 pairs for the UK. Rolling forward to 2013, Rob Clements produced a population estimate stating there between 500 and 1,000 pairs in the UK. So it's quite a reduction in a relatively short period of time. At that time, a lot of that data was based on some of the remaining strongholds. So at that time, the New Forest we had down as 200 pairs. Now, based on what we've been doing over the last decade, we know now that actually that's more like 350 pairs in the New Forest. And so those figures for the Wye Valley and Forested Dean and Meredith below are possibly low as well. But either way, what's highlighted is for one thing, the population in the UK has declined quite dramatically, and also that the New Forest, along with just a handful of other places, remains an important stronghold for hawfinch in the UK. So, monitoring hawfinches. I've been monitoring roosts right from the beginning. So when we had that first meeting back in 2012 or whenever it was, there was a well-known hawfinch roost at Blackwater Arboretum, which is still active and has been recorded back to the 1980s as an active roost. And I'd found one or two other places that I thought were roosts in the forest. And so that piqued my interest, because hawfinches are a tricky species, as we all know. They're really hard to get to grips with. They're quite elusive. They're quite quiet, quite subtle. Their nesting is an absolute pain, because they nest quite late in the season once the bud burst once the leaves have burst out, and nests can be hard to find. They're a quiet species, so yeah, just generally tricky. So one way I figured of recording all the hawfinches in one place at one time was at the roost, and so I set about monitoring the roosts. So rolling forward to today, I found 50 roosts across the New Forest, and 3 just outside the New Forest. So I monitor these roosts year round, There's 3 roosts that I monitor monthly, year round, and the rest I try to do once a year because it's just too many now. With 50 roosts, too many to do them all the time. But trying to understand the roosts is really important. So for one thing, the roosts are used at different times, so they're used all year round. Some roosts are busier in the winter months. Other roosts are used exclusively during the spring and summer months. Other roosts are used year round. They're all slightly different. We've got different types of roost, 3 or 4 different types of roost. But what they have in common really is largely that they're in soft conifers. In the New Forest, it's in Douglas fir and spruce. We have 1 or 2 in holly, and also a couple that are in ivy on oak. And I presume that these in holly and ivy on oak are where hawfinch would have roosted prior to the arrival of these non-native conifers that we have across the New Forest now. There's a few other things that they have in common, that they're often on the edge or close to an open area, or an area that's recently been clear felled. There's sort of an open aspect to them. They're all pretty much sheltered with an easterly aspect, and that's because our prevailing wind conditions are from the southwest here in the New Forest, and so that makes sense that they're sheltered from the prevailing wind direction. And we find that when the wind does change to an easterly, it messes up the roosts. So in fact, I stopped counting roosts when we've got an easterly because it's just hard to gauge where the birds are going to be roosting. And they have these large gathering trees. As you can see, this is in the image here. This is a classic New Forest hawfinch roost. This is one down near Burley, and you can see there a big prominent conifer in the middle. And these conifers, normally there'd be 2 or 3 similar trees across the roost that they used to gather in, both pre and post roost. They'll always gather in the same tree, and they're often at the heart of a colony as well. So that's the other thing. So they're often close by an area where they nest colonially quite frequently. And so during the summer, what will often happen is the roost stays active, but not as busy, so that the females stay on the nest all the time. Throughout the cycle, but the males will come off and roost in their communal roost. Not exclusively we've found, but quite frequently they use the roost. So this is a typical roost down in the southwest of the forest, down near Burley. So zooming in, you see one of those prominent trees. This is typical in the morning of up to about 15 hawfinches gathering here, and they'll do this in a cycle, gather in small numbers in the morning, have a little chatter with one another, and then head off to feed for the day. I monitor the roosts 30 minutes either side of sunrise, so I get on site 30 minutes before the advertised sunrise time, record all the relevant conditions, and map the time and direction of birds going off or out of roost, and map specific roost site locations. And then I also at the same time record all other species using the roost. So most of the roosts aren't just exclusively hawfinch. We also have a range of finches using the roost, predominantly siskins, chaffinches, crossbills, when they're around, bramblings, and that sort of thing. And also I record other potential predators or raptors in the area. So a lot of our roosts in the forest seem to be shared or close by goshawk nest sites, which is an interesting common theme, which is possibly down to, I wonder, it's probably partly a quirk of the conditions that the goshawk's roosts are sheltered. So nest sites are sheltered, but also possibly that the goshawks play a role in removing some other potential pest predators from the area, like jays and jackdaws in particular. Okay, so I'll just move on through. We've only got 15 minutes for the talk, so I'll move through fairly rapidly. So this is just an overview of all the roost sites that we have mapped in the New Forest. All the red dots are roosts that are active, that I'm monitoring. The blue dots are areas where I'm pretty sure there's a roost, but I haven't quite nailed it yet. So they take a bit of work to pin down the actual roost sites. Some of these may turn out not to be roosts, but that's where I believe there is a roost. But it's sort of like a work in progress, as it were. So I think we've almost got complete coverage for the forest. There's probably maybe another 4, 5, 6 roosts to find to cover the forest. Okay, so in addition, we do a bit of colour ringing to determine what's going on with hawfinch. So we partake in an RAS scheme, a BTO RAS scheme, where we have baited sites across the New Forest. So we bait sites using sunflower seed coming out of an automated feeder that drops on the ground, attracts in hawfinches, and then we use a whoosh net to cover, to catch the hawfinches. We have extra bait stations where we rig up with trail cameras, so high resolution trail cameras, so that as the hawfinches come in to feed, we can record their colour rings. So we're constantly recording birds coming and going, and that helps us better understand how movements across the forest, how different colour-ringed birds move. Turns out they don't move very far. Most of them don't move really any distance at all. We have 2 bait stations that are 600 metres apart, and we've had very little movement between even those 2. We do the ringing mainly from March through to July, when natural resources are at the lowest ebb. So this is just a picture, just so you can picture how the bait station looks. So that's the feeder hanging up in the tree, spits out seed onto the ground, where we catch the birds using a whoosh net. This is just an image here of a colour-ringed hawfinch. So currently all of our colour-ringed hawfinches have a yellow ring with a 2-digit code on them, and so they're easily picked up as they come down to the bait stations. So something else we've been doing is looking at foraging behaviour. So using GPS and radio tracking, looking at what hawfinches are feeding on. So we've done 2 rounds now with 10 lightweight GPS and radio tags. So it's a radio tag that emits a radio frequency, so we can track it, but also has GPS capability, so that it's recording a location once every 20 minutes on our tags. The tag's designed to fall off after about a month, where we use the radio receiver to track down and locate the tag once it's fallen off, to retrieve it and download the data. So what we're doing, we're tagging males during the breeding season. So as the female sits on the nest, the male does the foraging for the nest. So what we're looking at is what they're feeding on, and that's obviously the peak time where the male's not only getting food for itself, it's getting food for the female and for the young on the nest. So it's trying to get a better feel for what's going on. So this is just very quickly, this is an overview of our tagging 10 birds that we tagged in 2019, just to give you an idea of the spread and distribution of these birds. They're all tagged where the red cross is in the top center of the map, but then each different color is a different bird and its movements. So I could talk all day about all of these, but I've just picked a few just to highlight, because we're tight for time, so we'll just talk about 3 individuals. So this is the first one, IP. Sharp-eyed ones there will notice that the colouring is actually DN, but we put a new colouring on when we tagged this individual. So this male was tagged on the 26th of April 2019. I should say here that we targeted specific individuals. So we didn't just randomly tag males that turned up and were the right weight. We targeted individuals that we knew were locals or were regulars to the bait station, because we felt it was easier. We stood a better chance of retrieving the tag of regulars. We did just as a control. We did 2 previous unringed males each time, just to check their movements, just as a control. But the data we're generating, we're talking about here, is from birds that we know. So this tag was only on this bird for 2 weeks, and here at the bottom of the image, it looks very busy, but these are the movements. And so down in the bottom right by the red dot is where the tag was put on. And interesting, when we were radio tracking, all we had while we were radio tracking is in this area, Bratley enclosure. This is the big concentration of dots. It was only when we retrieved the tag that we found out that this individual had been moving up to the northeast to a little small clump of hollies. We had no idea it was going there. We didn't pick that up on the radio tracking. So it's fascinating. So this bird actually had a nest. We worked out, we actually pretty much found the nest in Bratley enclosure. What was interesting, it was spending most of its time in Bratley enclosure, which is an oak plantation, and it was foraging in there pretty much all day. But at dawn and at dusk, or at the beginning and at the end of the day, it would move up here to these hollies. It's just a little group of hollies where it would feed, sometimes for 20 minutes, sometimes for over an hour. And there's nothing there. I've been up there quite a few times. It's just a pure stand of hollies with a U in the middle. And here you often have hawfinches feeding on the ground, and what they're feeding on here is holly seeds. So holly seeds coming out of the berry. So what's interesting, what we can surmise from this is that the adult is feeding in Bratley enclosure on invertebrates, collecting invertebrate food for the nest, and then going to feed on holly seeds pre and post roost for self-sustenance. So this is just a quick view showing the images of both Bratley enclosure, the nest site, and Fritham Cross, where it was going to feed in the hollies. This is our next bird, LH. It's just a quick video clip of LH at the nest. This is the female, unringed and untagged female, but this is LH coming in from the right just to feed the chicks. So with the use of the tags, it also helps us just find the nest. So this nest had 4 chicks, all successfully fledged, which is great news. Off it goes. So here, this is interesting data. So the red cross on the map is where the nest was. The red dots are where LH roosted. And what we found is LH spent most of the day feeding in Bratley enclosure and Bratley Arch, which are 2 areas of largely oak with a bit of beech. But then it would move across dawn and dusk, similar to the previous bird, into a holly home. And this was a holly with a few Scots pine and a couple of yews, where it would feed dawn and dusk in a similar way to IP, which is fascinating. So we're getting a theme here from these hawfinches. But as with everything, I'll just finish on KX, which threw everything out the window. So KX was ringed like the others, tagged up at Boulderwood. But here on the map, every cross is somewhere where we tracked KX with the radio tracker, and he was recorded singing. So in each of these positions, so in Bratley enclosure, in Markash Wood, and all the way down even in Wilverley, this individual was recorded singing. So this threw everything out the window, because normally if I was out in the field recording these singing birds, it would be, I'd mark that as a potential breeding site. But yes, this scuppered. So it just goes to show, as soon as you start to get a theme and a pattern, there's always one individual that throws it out. So we're learning a lot, but there's still an awful lot to learn. Right, just a little bit about Wild New Forest. We're a small not-for-profit organisation operating in the forest, and I'm happy to take any questions at the end. If anybody has any, apologies for running 2 minutes over.
Thank you, Marcus. That's a fascinating talk. I think you're going to join us live. Excellent. Cool. We've got a couple of minutes. Hello, Marcus. How you doing?
Yeah, good. Sorry, I'm in a car this evening, so sorry about that.
That's okay. Well, we've only got a couple of minutes anyway. So asks, do you think breeding numbers have increased following the invasion of a few years ago?
No, we thought that might have an impact, but no, we didn't have any evidence of an increase. Even in fact, during the invasion, we had an initial increase in numbers, but they soon dissipated because that coincided with what was a bad beech mast crop year. So numbers of hawfinch over that winter within the New Forest actually were quite low compared to the rest of the country. So yeah, it didn't seem to have any impact at all.
Okay, cool. And Steve wants to know what the success rate of nests are, and have you identified the main predators or reasons for failure?
Yeah, success. Well, finding nests is a challenge. So we haven't got a huge data set on nest success, but where we've found nests, the statistic is about 60% success rate. So they are fairly successful at the nesting stage. Their main predator appears to be corvids and jays. Jays in particular are the main issue. Although we've had nest cameras on hawfinch nests a fair bit and recorded a whole mix of predators. We've had goshawk, lots of jays, carrion crow, squirrels. We've had a few times, but they've been successfully chased off by the hawfinch. But so it's quite a mixed bag. A lot of it depends on where they're nesting. They're quite eclectic in their choice of nest sites. So those that are nesting in sort of lower areas like in holly and so on seem more vulnerable than those in more mature beech and oak.
Cool. Okay, and one very last quick question. How big is the average roost size?
Well, that goes from so the largest roost I'm monitoring has about 70 birds generally, and that goes all the way down to 10. So there's a huge range. So a lot of it depends on where it is, what the habitat is. But yes, so I would say the average is probably 30 to 35 individuals, but there's a huge variation.
Okay, that's perfect. Thank you, Marcus, and thanks for making a special effort to join us this evening in our celebration.
No
Cool.
worries. Thank you very much.
Cheers. That's okay.
Thank you.
Okay,
Bye.
thanks. Bye. So next up is Molly Doubleday, who works as Capercaillie Advisor Officer for the RSPB, part funded by the Cairngorms Capercaillie Project and Nature Scot. So her role includes providing advice to landowners, statutory bodies and NGOs on beneficial management for Capercaillie. She also leads on the national monitoring of Capercaillie in Scotland. So over to you, Molly.
Hello, I'm Molly. I work as Capercaillie Advisory Officer for the RSPB. I'm also part funded by the Cairngorms Capercaillie Project and Nature Scot. And today I'm going to be talking about Capercaillie counting and conservation. So Capercaillie are actually the world's largest grouse, and they are found in populations across Europe, but in the UK they are restricted to Scotland. They live in pine forests. Scots pine is their preferred species, it's a native species. They feed on pine needles during the winter months, and then during the spring, summer months, they're more diverse diet. So they'll feed on stuff growing on a field layer, with blaeberry being a particularly important plant. The chicks will eat invertebrates for the first 4 weeks of their life. So blaeberry is also a great host of invertebrates, and bog is also a great habitat for Capercaillie because of those invertebrates and their cotton grass, which is a great nutrient-rich diet, food resource for the adult birds. So this is taken at a Capercaillie elect. So this is when the birds mate. So essentially the males will return to the same areas in the forest year on year, roughly, if conditions remain suitable, and they will display, and the aim of that is to attract in females to mate with. So they'll start these displays pre-dawn from about 4 a.m. if not earlier, and it tends to be just one alpha, maybe two alpha birds that the hens will mate with. After the lek season, the hens will then go away and brood rear her chicks, and they nest in a scrape on the ground, and they will be with the chicks until about August time, and then the chicks will be fully independent and able to fledge. So I wanted to chat a little bit about how we count this species and perhaps some of the challenges we face in counting such an elusive species, particularly when they are quite rare. So the main way we get national population estimates for Capercaillie is through conducting our national surveys. We've been doing this since the early 90s, and we do it every 6 years. We believe that there was about 20,000 Capercaillie in Scotland in the 1970s, but as you can see, there's been a pretty steep decline since then. So these national surveys essentially involve trained surveyors walking across the Capercaillie range. It's the same method that's used every time so that we can directly compare them. So they'll walk transects and collect information on primarily sightings, but also signs of Capercaillie. And that allows us to get a national estimate. So the birds, or the estimate, was varying between about 1,000 and 2,000 birds, with fairly wide confidence intervals since the early 90s. But unfortunately, our most recent national survey in the winter of 2021-2022 estimated about a 50% decline on the previous survey, with only roughly 542 birds estimated to be remaining in Scotland. So we're definitely in a quite serious situation with Capercaillie now. This just demonstrates the Capercaillie range. So the purple areas are the Capercaillie SPAs. So they range from the most northern region is in Easter Ross, and the most southern region is in Tayside. The vast majority are within the Cairngorms National Park with Strathspey and Deeside. And Strathspey, Badenoch and Strathspey in particular, has over 80% of the population. So that is definitely the stronghold, and that's what those red lines are indicating at the Capercaillie core areas. So another way we count Capercaillie on an annual basis is through doing let counts. So essentially, because the birds return roughly to the same area every year when they lek, we can get a count on the males and compare that year on year. We do record the females, but they don't always attend every single morning, so the hens will tend to come in on certain mornings, so it's not as a useful index to count, but of course it's still important data, so we do record when we see them. So this method essentially involves, if we know where a lek is and it's quite steady, we can use a hide to count the birds from. So this is a photo of a hide. They're very tiny, basically very uncomfortable tents with no ground sheet and quite heavy to carry around and not particularly waterproof. So they're not the most glamorous thing to spend a night in, but that's what we do. We go in the night before, sleep-ish overnight, and then make sure we're ready to count the birds from 4 a.m. Because it is dark still at that time, we do these counts in about the last 2 weeks of April. That tends to be the peak time for birds to be lekking. It can be challenging, so we do have to listen, but also started using thermal imagers to help us with these counts. If we're less sure where a lek is, or if there's a lek there at all, then we'll tend to do a walkover survey in the early morning to see if there is any sign of birds, but preferably we always use highs because this is the way that we can reduce disturbance and probably get the most accurate count we can. So this is just some data on the let count. So we get that minimum number of males that we can compare year on year. And you can see, again, there's been a decline since 2015. So the last national survey was the winter of 2015-2016. And we have seen consistent declines, apart from the last 2 years where actually we had the exact same number of males overall, which is quite interesting. But this splits it down by the different regions. And it's just showing, gets a useful annual insight into what's happening with the birds. We're also trialling something new. So through the Cairngorms Capercaillie project that I'll be touching on a little bit more later on in the presentation, we are trialling a genetic lek survey. And this essentially looks at gathering their droppings and getting genetic information from these. And we'll look to compare what is found with these droppings, so the total number of birds and individuals that are identified from the droppings compared to what we see when we do our let count from the hides. We're only doing a very small scale study this year. We've only chosen a couple of leks to trial this at, but there has been success in doing this internationally, so we're quite hopeful that this could be maybe an option. Potentially less disturbing because we don't have to be there in the early morning when the birds are lekking, but it depends on how many times you have to go in to collect droppings. So it's very much a pilot study, but it'll be interesting to see what comes out of that, and we're hoping to get that report in September this year. And then finally, the other counts we do involve brood counts. So this gets information on the birds' productivity. Traditionally, this has involved trained dogs and handlers going out into Capercaillie Forest in August. So this is when the chicks are big and able to fly, but they're likely to still be in a family party and still be identified as juveniles rather than adults. So then essentially the birds are flushed and they are counted that way. And that's reduced over time through a few reasons. One, it's very resource intensive and there's not a huge number of trained dogs and handlers available for these counts. And also there are concerns that this is obviously going to be quite disturbing for the birds. So we want to make sure we do it when we absolutely need this productivity data. So we have been trialling using camera traps across Cairngorms Connect in particular, including RSPB Abernethy Reserve. And that's shown some initial signs that this could be a useful method. It's still early days, but we've had some nice photos of broods, which is also always nice. So a little bit more into the threats and what we're doing to try and conserve Capercaillie. So the threats to Capercaillie are very varied. Habitat is a big one. There's not a huge amount of suitable habitat for Capercaillie, and what is available can be quite fragmented, and the birds don't have a huge dispersal distance, and they also don't like crossing lots of open ground. We do a lot to try and improve and extend habitat, and a lot of that comes down to deer management. So obviously if the deer numbers are too high, forests will struggle to expand and link, and also the deer can overgraze the field layer, which has important plants like I mentioned earlier, like blaeberry. So it is a challenge, but it's definitely an important thing we're working on. Fence collisions is another risk to capercaillie. So capercaillie can collide with essentially mostly deer fences. So if the deer fences are running through or close to a forest, the birds fly quite low. They don't fly up and over the trees. They tend to fly straight through the trees, and sometimes they can't see them. We find this is especially the case with juveniles that are just a bit less savvy and aware of fences in general and where they are. So what we do with that is we advise that deer are controlled without fences ideally and are just cold, but if fences are absolutely necessary, then we strongly advise they are marked to increase visibility and reduce that collision risk. Predation is another threat. Lots of things will eat a capercaillie, and we have high numbers of these generalist meter predators in Scotland and the UK generally. So things like foxes and crows, but also other species and other protected species like pine marten and raptors. I was once on a lek when a juvenile golden eagle came in to try and take an alpha male capercaillie. The capercaillie got away on that instance, but it just demonstrates that lots of things will eat them, especially nests and eggs and chicks. So that can be an issue, and it can be challenging to manage, especially when some of these species are protected themselves. Climate change, that's another one. So that can have a real impact on the bird's productivity, especially high rainfall when the chicks are small. So in May, June time, they can get overly chilled and get hypothermia. And then finally, human disturbance, that can reduce the habitat further because capercaillie avoid areas that are very busy, like forest tracks, for instance, and can also have a direct impact on their fitness and productivity by increasing their stress levels and potentially avoid stopping them mating at leks or separating the hens from the chicks. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the Cairngorms Capercaillie project. This has been the sort of biggest bit of work that's been going on directly with capercaillie the last few years. It's a national lottery heritage funded partnership project, and it's being led by the Cairngorms National Park Authority, and the delivery phase started in 2020 and we're actually in our last year now. We're into 2023, and the overall aim of this project is to enable communities to secure the long-term survival of capercaillie. It's primarily focusing on reducing that human disturbance issue because visitor numbers in some of the key capercaillie areas are always on the rise, so it's something we really need to tackle. So in terms of the work, there's 5 key areas of work with this project. This is probably the biggest. So this is working with communities. So this can be communities of place, like local residents, but also communities of interest that might have potential conflict with capercaillie, and we want to try and work with them, like mountain bikers, and also working with local businesses and visitors to the capercaillie areas, and creating community-led action plans to try and conserve capercaillie and reduce the negative impacts of human disturbance. As well as all that community work, there is some other stuff that we've been in that project, including improving habitat for capercaillie. So we have improved over 10,000 hectares of habitat for capercaillie with working with local land managers and providing them financial support. A lot of this work's also been done with volunteers, local people, which is great because it's a way to engage them with this work and raise awareness about capercaillie. So this is just an example of some volunteers marking a fence there, which again is to reduce that collision risk for capercaillie. So we're also doing some research into the genetic diversity of capercaillie. So we collected a lot of feathers, so over 600 feathers in 2019, and we're working with RZSS to analyse these to get an idea about the levels of diversity of capercaillie. And this will give us an indication maybe of the health of the birds. So we've also managed to get samples from international capercaillie populations and historical Scottish populations from museums and private collections. So we'll get that really good availability to compare and contrast what the current Scottish population is like, and that will help inform future management for capercaillie, and we're hoping to get that report pretty soon now in April this year, so that's quite exciting. Strengthen capercaillie monitoring. So again, this is primarily the pilot genetic lek survey I mentioned, but also we've been funding other bits and bobs. We've been funding some more brood counts in areas. They've been doing interventions that we really want to test whether they're working, and we've also been putting out camera traps and funding thermal imagers and just stuff to try and improve our monitoring as much as possible so we can make the most informed decisions. And finally, this project is all about raising awareness of capercaillie and finding that fine line between we want people to love and care about protecting capercaillie, but we also don't want them to be disturbed. And that can be especially the case with people that are very passionate about capercaillie and want to see them, birders, photographers, etc. That in itself can be a real risk to the birds. So it's a challenging one, trying to get people to care but don't want people to go and see them. So it's always a line that we're trying to walk carefully, but it's something that is very, very important. The only way we're going to save capercaillie is if people both care about the birds and understand what they can really do to protect them. So that's everything from me. Thank you very much for listening. I hope that was an interesting insight into capercaillie counting and conservation, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Molly. That's a really fascinating talk. I've definitely seen more of your little wooden capercaillies on fence posts than I have seen capercaillies.
Yeah, they're great. Our happy cappies.
Yeah. We've got a few questions coming in, some of which you've touched on already, so I'll pick some of the others that you haven't. So there's one from Paul about what information are you using from for your 1970s data?
That one's a bit mixed. So some of it has come from capercaillie used to be shot, so it come from like game bag data. Some of it's come from bits and bobs of research and counting that was done before then. But to be honest, we do say that that is quite a not a guess, an estimate, an estimated guess in terms of that's what broadly we think the numbers are at, but they weren't as carefully monitored until we started doing the national surveys in the early 90s.
Okay, great. And Ken's asking, is pine marten predator predation an issue?
Yes, well, pine martens definitely predate capercaillie. Loads of research to show that's the case, and they're both native to Scotland, so obviously that is something. And we know that they're also very good at finding nests in particular and raiding nests. So yeah, they're just one of the many things that will eat capercaillie.
Okay, great, thank you. And Heather's asking, sorry, lots of questions coming in. It moved. Is captive breeding program or reintroduction an option to boost the population?
It's not anything that's ever off the table, but there's a lot of issues with it, mostly because there's been lots of capercaillie reinforcements, reintroductions abroad, actually, but hardly any of them are successful. It's very difficult to replicate the natural environment, like a lek environment, that capercaillie need to breed successfully, and there's issues with releasing chicks that haven't been reared with hens. They don't know how to survive. There's lots of issues to it, and we also wouldn't want to and aren't actually allowed through our IUCN guidelines to reinforce a population until we're confident that we've got on top of the issues with the current population and why they've declined anyway. So it's not something that's currently being pursued, but we appreciate, with the numbers as they are, it's never completely off the table.
Great. Okay, thank you. One from Helen. Do grouse shoots cause capercaillie casualties or disturbance?
Probably quite unlikely. So a lot of those happen out with capercaillie habitat, more on like open moors and grouse moors, for instance. Obviously capercaillie are protected species, so they're not it's illegal to actually harm them, and I don't think that's a huge level disturbance compared to the normal kind of recreational disturbance you get in forests.
Okay, great. And Ray's saying 10,000 hectares of restored habitat sounds fantastic. How many birds do you think that could support?
Oh, that's always a tough one, isn't there?
Isn't it?
I wouldn't be able to guess off the top of my head, but to be honest, that 10,000 hectares is spread over lots of bits and bobs as opposed to like one big new area of habitat. But there's a lot of stuff that's going on to expand their habitat out with the project, like the Kangles Connect project and things like that that's going on. But the thing is about habitat is we need to make sure it's suitable, but also we need to manage the recreation pressure and stuff like that as well. So not everything is as suitable, but yeah, hopefully it's going to make some difference to the birds, at least a few.
Cool. Time for one or two more. So are birds fully protected in law?
Yes. So they're Schedule 1 listed species under the Wildlife Countryside Code.
Yeah. Okay, and Larry's asking, would lynx benefit capercaillie?
Potentially. So obviously having high numbers of those generalist mesopredators means there is an extra pressure on capercaillie, and if we had top predators like lynx, then maybe that would balance it out a bit more, but it's a bit of an unknown. So obviously adding another predator to the mix, we're not entirely sure how that would go, but there's potential.
Right, yeah, there were a couple of additional questions which you've largely answered in your talk. One about sort of, about the fence issue. Is there anything you can do to help? You talked about adding extra
Marking.
visibility, extra markers, and there's one question about birders seeking capercaillie sightings, disturbance, and there's quite a lot of extra effort this year, isn't there? I think.
Yes, yeah, we're doing a new lots of stuff, but we're particularly doing a new big comms campaign through the Cambridge Capercaillie project, calling it Let It Be, and trying to reach those people that we really appreciate. People want to see capercaillie, but it's a very significant threat to them during that specific lek period. So yeah, we're really trying to get the word out that if you really care, please don't go and see capercaillie.
Great. I think we'll leave it there for questions, Molly. Thank you very much for a really fascinating talk this evening.
Great,
Cool.
thank you very much.
Okay, we're going to have a quick 10-minute break now and be coming back at 8:15 to hear from Sarah Anthony and Ali Giacomelli. So thanks for your attention so far, and see you in 10 minutes. Welcome back. The next talk this evening is a double act from Sarah Anthony and Ali Giacomelli. Sarah has worked for Natural England and prior to this English Nature since 1998 and is a senior ornithologist in the birds team. She mainly works on protected sites casework and species recovery projects and is a team lead on SSSI notification for birds. Ali is also a senior ornithologist working in Natural England's National Birds team, leading on condition assessment, working and advising on the impacts of developments on birds. Prior to Natural England, Ali spent 12 years in the RSPB's South East region, working on heathlands, coastal and marine habitats. The talk this evening is on the use of rare breeding bird panel data for protected sites work in Natural England.
Hello, my name's Sarah Anthony. I'm a senior ornithologist at Natural England. Together with my colleague Ali Giacomelli, we will be giving a brief overview of the role of rare breeding bird panel data for protected sites work in Natural England. In this first part, I will be talking about its use as evidence to support SSSI notification. First, I'll touch on the bird features of the SSSIs, look at the evidence needs for the scientific case and the role of rare breeding bird panel data, and I'll finish with a case study. SSSIs are the finest sites for wildlife and natural features supporting many rare and endangered habitats and species. There are currently 4,128 SSSIs in England, with 590 notified for one or more bird feature. There are three main criteria for site selection for birds: aggregations of breeding birds, so localities which regularly support 1% or more of the total British breeding population of any native species, and seabird colonies over 10,000 breeding pairs will qualify for selection. The next one, aggregations of non-breeding birds. These are localities which regularly support 1% or more of the total British non-breeding population of any native species in any season. And non-breeding waterbird assemblages of more than 20,000 individuals will qualify. And finally, assemblages of breeding birds. So localities which support an especially good range of breeding bird species that are characteristic of a particular habitat defined by an index value will qualify. There is, however, scope for improvement in representation across the SSSI series, for example, where we're looking at more dispersed species, rapidly increasing species, and where we have little data for particular species. So rare breeding bird panel data can provide supporting evidence where we're looking at aggregations of breeding birds and also for assemblages of breeding birds as site features. For more details of SSI selection guidelines, I've added a link here to the publication on JNCT's website, and Chapter 17 covers birds. So what evidence is needed to support the case for site selection? In many cases, we will commission our own surveys. However, we do rely on and use a range of data collected and submitted by volunteers. Examples are wetland bird surveys, and of course, rare breeding bird panel data. A partnership between trained and skilled volunteers and professional scientists ensures that data are collected using rigorous methods and standards. They are then analysed and validated, resulting in the production of reports and peer-reviewed publications. So this data is well respected and widely valued. Of the 3 SSI cases I've been involved with in the last year or so, all have relied heavily on such data, and in fact all have presented rare breeding bird panel data as part of the evidence to support the case. So it's really critical. So I'll finish with an example of a live case. The Penwith Moors SSI in Cornwall was notified in October last year. It's a 3,000 hectare site comprising heathland, wetland and acid grassland, and it supports a number of rare and threatened habitats and species. An initial desk study of existing breeding bird records across the area for consideration indicated likely importance for breeding birds. So surveys were carried out in 2014 and again in 2015, and these found that the site supported 55 pairs of Dartford warbler. That was in both years, actually, very consistent. So this represented 2.5% of the British population, and this is well in excess of the 1% threshold. Now, this is a complex site. It's got a number of interest features, and it's taken time to gather the evidence for the site and put together the case. It was to be considered by our executive committee to decide whether to progress with this in early 2022, so last year, and we knew that the age of the data by that time would be questioned. So at this stage, we decided to seek additional evidence, and we requested rare breeding bird panel data from 2016 to 2020. So this map shows the SSI boundary outlined in red, and records of probable or confirmed breeding pairs from the 2014 survey are shown in blue, and those from 2015 in green. The pale blue 1 kilometre squares on the map show locations where probable or confirmed Dartford warbler breeding pairs were recorded from 2016 to 2021, and this is principally from the rare breeding bird panel dataset, but it also includes additional records, a few from the Cornwall Bird Watching and Preservation Society. Now, these 1 kilometre squares correspond spatially with the records from the 2014 and 15 surveys, but as you can see, additional 1 kilometre squares are also occupied. So this indicates both persistence in breeding across the original locations and also a possible expansion from these core areas. So these records, together with information on the national trend for this species, which we know is stable, and also what we know about the ecology of this species, gave us strong additional evidence to support the original survey data and the decision to include this species as a feature of the site. So the consultation period for this SSI closed on the 7th of February, and our board will be considering whether to confirm the site as a SSI in May of this year. So we'll see what happens there. So finally, I'd like to emphasise the importance of rare breeding bird panel data as corroborative and supporting information for SSI cases. If time allowed, I could give more examples, but I can't stress enough how valuable these records are. However, we can only make use of them if they are collected and formally submitted in a timely manner. So please keep up the good work. Thank you.
Hello, my name's Alison Giacomelli and I'm a senior ornithologist in the National Birds team in Natural England. I lead on our work on condition assessment, so I'm here to tell you a little bit about that work and the importance of the RBBP data in it. Once a site's been notified, as Sarah's described, Natural England periodically assesses the condition of triple SIs so we can make sure that they're being well managed for the species they're important for. Recently, the government published its Environmental Improvement Plan, which sets out targets for having up-to-date condition assessments for all triple SIs by 2028. It's great to have a statutory target like this because it really bumps things up the priority list. It's fair to say that we're behind with a lot of site assessments. By up-to-date, we mean within the last 6 years, but a lot of triple SIs have fallen behind that, so there's a big push now to get that sorted out. Once we know the condition of a site, we can start putting in place remedies when habitats or populations are failing, and there's a target to get 50% of sites into favourable or recovering condition by 2028. By recovering condition, we mean all the actions to restore the population or habitat are being implemented. Some features will start improving straight away, but some may take a bit longer before they're fully recovered. This map shows the triple SIs that are notified for their populations of RBBP species, 140 in all. Some RBBP species have a lot of triple SIs, so there are 34 Dartford warbler sites and 27 with little terns on them. But some, like spotted crake, marsh warbler and quail, have just one triple SI. The 140 triple SIs here are just notified for the populations in their own right, and they tend to be the species that are rare but nest colonially, like little terns, or nest on restricted habitats like Dartford warbler or woodlark on heathlands. But there are also triple SIs notified for their assemblages of a certain habitat, and that's where RBBP data on rare but widely dispersed species is incredibly helpful. For example, the woodland assemblage triple SIs were often notified for species including hawfinches and lesser spotted woodpeckers that we're hearing about in this conference. So it's really important that we use information on where they are to improve woodland management for them. Of the internationally designated sites, Special Protection Areas or SPAs, 55 of the total 90 are designated for RBBP species. All terrestrial SPAs are underpinned by triple SIs, and so the sorts of species they're designated for is similar. But for SPAs, the criterion is that they support 1% of the international population of a species. So again, the species with the most SPAs is little tern with 29 sites, but at the other end of the scale, there's 2 sites for pochard and 2 for black-tailed godwit, for example. So your data could play a massive part in increasing our understanding of how birds are doing on triple SIs and SPAs, so that we've got the ammunition to improve habitat management where it's needed. To take bittern for an example, there are 9 triple SIs notified for breeding bitterns. Using RBBP data, we can look at how the triple SI suite is performing for bitterns. To condition assess a population, we compare the current numbers on the site to the time of notification. If numbers haven't declined more than 25% for a breeding population, then the site is in favourable condition. But I should stress that that 25% is to take account of natural fluctuations in numbers. If there are anthropogenic reasons for a decline of less than 25%, then we would still call that unfavourable, so that actions to remedy the situation are taken. And alongside population size, we also look at the habitat area and compare that to the size at time of notification to make sure there hasn't been any decrease. We know, again from RBBP data, that bitterns are doing well nationally, thanks to concerted conservation effort. So it's not really surprising that 7 of the 9 bitten SSSIs are in favourable condition. Of the unfavourable ones, given the national population is increasing, the bitten data tells us to look at the habitats on site and make sure that they're suitable. So as well as habitat extent, we'd look at habitat quality. So water levels, water quality, amount of reader edge available, disturbance and food availability. And then we can put in place measures to sort out those problems to get the site in favourable condition. And then looping back to what Sarah's been saying, the distribution data can be used to make sure that we've got the most important sites for bitten notified so they can be protected from external impacts. And I just wanted to end with a thank you for all your efforts in collecting data and supplying it to the RBBP. It's a fantastic resource that I'd like to make sure that Natural England makes much more use of. Up until now, we've tended to request data for individual sites or maybe counties for condition assessments. But I'd like to do more of the national look, like the bitten example, so that we can look strategically at the suite of sites and how they're performing. So thanks again to all the volunteers and to the RBBP for inviting us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Ali. That's a great talk showing just how valuable the panel data can be. So, Ali, I can see you, and I think Sarah's joining us here now. Great. Sarah, did you want to give a quick update on your talk?
Yes, thanks, Dawn. I just wanted to make a correction about the map that I presented. The blue shaded squares also were records of possible Dartford Warburg as well as probable and confirmed. So that was an error.
That's okay. Not fine. I just had a quick question, and maybe you haven't used the panel data enough yet to know whether there's gaps in knowledge. You know, when you're looking for data sets, are there particular species that you struggle to find enough data for, or geographical areas that it's hard to get enough supporting information for?
In terms of my experience in looking at particular SSSI cases, it depends on the interest and coverage in specific areas and the expertise of those collecting and submitting records. So in some places, you'll maybe around a focal reserve or something like that, you'll get a lot of data and information that's submitted, but it can vary quite considerably. Yeah, I don't know if Ali has got any comments about how that relates to the monitoring data.
So I don't think I know yet. As I say, it's a massive resource that I think we could make more use of. So yeah, I haven't had that kind of national look yet at the range of species.
Okay, good. Steve's asking questions. So for species population has a published breeding range, for example, Hawfinch was between 500 and 1,000 pairs. At which end do you take the 1% qualifying number from?
The qualifying number is based on the published APEP, Avian Population Panel Estimates. That's the reference that we use as a basis for measuring whether the threshold of 1% is reached for an aggregation.
Okay, so yeah, he's just talking about a range. So if there's a published estimate is 500 to 1,000, you take a midpoint.
Yeah, I mean, we'd rely on that published. That's the standard that we use, and obviously, when that's updated, the authors that are looking at the data and they adjust those estimates, don't they, based on data that's fed in by RBBP and other sources. So that's carried out at that stage, as far as I'm aware.
Okay, cool. Thanks. And Pete's asking, do you get much pushback from landowners when attempting to designate new SSSIs?
It depends. It's quite variable, but that's why it's very important to have a robust case and to present all the information and all the supporting evidence we can, and to be as open as we can about that, because we are going to be challenged about that. And our executive committee will be looking at the evidence when they're deciding whether it meets the guidelines. And again, if there's outstanding objections, our board will take a final decision as to whether the site should be notified. And it's the strength of the scientific case to robust some of the objections is very important. So we need to go at it with all the data and evidence we've got. So.
Okay, good. And just one last question from Paul, who's asking how or who can propose a site for SSI assessment?
For assessment or as a
He's put assessment.
New site.
Yeah.
Well, anything can be put forward really to be looked at. We've got, there's a pipeline of cases going forward, and obviously our specialists and people in our area teams and other colleagues and partners will raise sites or priority sites, but we have to look at the resource we've got and put things. It's quite a kind of resource heavy task to get a site through the process. So definitely we'll have some on the list, and we'll try and prioritise those based on the resource we've got. But yes, usually it's our own specialists and staff or colleagues and partners in other organisations that might give us that information.
Yeah, he meant for a new site, but
yeah. So,
yeah, cool. Brilliant.
But yeah, members of the public can contact their local team with it and just, raise the profile of sites, and we can look at that and get them on the list, on the pipeline for consideration.
Yep. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Ali. Sorry you had trouble with your sound, Ali. So yeah, thanks very much both, and I'll move on to next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Cool. Our next talk this evening is from Mark Mallory, the chair of the Scientific Committee of the Sussex Ornithological Society, editor of an annual Sussex Bird Report, and former recorder for the county. He spent almost 40 years with the UK's Department for International Development, often living overseas, and most recently in South Sudan and Afghanistan. He's now retired and based in Sussex, and he has a particular interest in honey buzzards and hawfinches. He's published a number of papers on birds of Sussex, Africa and Asia. So please welcome Mark to talk about the honey buzzard.
Hi everyone, I'm Mark, and I'm going to be talking about surveying honey buzzards, or perhaps I should say European honey buzzards, Ernest apivorus, as there are 3 other members of the genus in Asia. I really like the Dutch name, actually, wasp thief, because, as you know, these birds specialise in predating wasp nests. In fact, if you look carefully, you can see that this adult male has got wasp comb in its talons that it's presumably taking back to its nest. This talk mainly focuses on Sussex. There's a brief foray into Kent, but what I'm talking about will be relevant to any parts of Britain where honey buzzards occur or could occur. So just before we get into that, I'm going to say something about species global and national conservation status very briefly. So starting globally, there's the breeding range right across Europe into Central Asia. It's an IUCN species of least concern, considered to have a stable global population within this sort of range. And they winter in sub-Saharan Africa, and that's where the juveniles will spend the first 80 months of their lives before returning as young adults, not to breed initially, but to spend the summer on the breeding grounds. Is that population estimate accurate? Well, there's been recent counts from Batumi, the famous raptor watch point in Georgia, of over 500,000 adults in the autumn, and they're presumably coming from the eastern part of the range. So that global population of the IUCN looks like it's considerably too low. It's nice to start off this talk with some good news. Turning to Europe, and I'm taking this from the second European Breeding Bird Atlas, the situation is uncertain. There's evidence of some declines, but also potentially some increases elsewhere in Europe. And then looking at the position in Britain, the paper in British Birds 2022 by Rob Clements and others covers the national survey and estimates 150 territories in Britain. Clearly that's very small in relation to the global population. It's an amber listed species under the Birds of Conservation Concern 5. I think it's always been amber listed in those reports. And then applying the IUCN criteria to Britain, it's considered endangered due to the small range and population. That's perhaps surprising, although you could imagine large-scale conifer plantation felling, perhaps as a result of invertebrate pest infestation, could lead to a local reduction in available breeding habitat. So turning to Sussex now, this is the area of work that I'm involved in, breeding season surveys. There's an important long-running programme of ringing and nest studies in Sussex and elsewhere that Steve Roberts leads. I'm not going to be talking about that because that's his field and not mine, although I do help him from time to time. Very enjoyable it is too. I'd like to be able to talk to you about migration in Sussex, but we really haven't got a Falsterbo despite the best efforts of Beachy Head on a good autumn day. So yeah, it's breeding season surveys that I'm involved in. And I'm not going to talk to you about detecting honey buzzards because that's really well covered in the literature, and that book on the left-hand side of your screen really tells you everything you need to know. But I will give you a few tips. One is to find out what the likely habitats are in the area you're searching, because the preferred habitat of breeding honey buzzards is not uniform across Britain. Secondly, and really important, don't be put off by absence of records. I've found many honey buzzards in Sussex in places where they've never been recorded before, and clearly there are a lot of bird watchers in Sussex. And thirdly, taking photographs of different birds helps you determine how many are present. This is a technique used with great effect by the Central Scotland Honey Buzzard Group. So you're looking for a viewpoint on a nice day between the middle of May and the end of August or early September for adults, and you need to be really optimistic, endless optimism and endless patience. These are quite secretive birds very often. You know, they stay under the canopy for hours on end, very unlike common buzzards. So be patient. So here's a map of Sussex, and I'm adding there a shape which covers the areas of the high weald and low weald and parts of the West and South Downs which contain suitable breeding habitat. Clearly the river valleys themselves don't have suitable breeding habitat. You can imagine if you're finding, you need to find viewpoints across that whole area, and each viewpoint gives you a radius of about 2 miles distance in each direction to watch. Then you need an awful lot of viewpoints. And it gives you some idea about how difficult it is to obtain full county coverage in a county like ours. We're lucky, of course, to have such a wooded county to be studying. I just wanted to say a little bit about the breeding season status categories that we use in Sussex, because we don't use the confirmed, probable, possible breeding status categories, which we find rather misleading. So these are the categories we use, and the reason we don't use the possible breeding category in particular is that this includes a single adult in breeding habitat in the breeding season, and we know from repeated observations at sites that these birds are definitely not breeding. And if we included them, so for 2022, for example, we get an extra 25 possible breeding pairs, which will give us a total of up to 55 breeding pairs, which is the same as for the whole of England in 2020. So you can see that it would be rather misleading. I've got the criteria that we use against each of those categories if anybody wants to see it, but I haven't included it here. It would make for a rather crowded slide. So in Sussex, the preferred breeding habitat is mixed broadleaf and coniferous woodland. I'll say something about status in a moment. This slide I chose, this photo I chose deliberately because honey buzzards summered here in 1931, and they weren't seen again here until 2019. And then last year we found juveniles here. So I can't stress too much the need to search places which have few or no previous records. So the earliest breeding in Sussex, 1976, although it could well have occurred earlier, possibly much earlier than that. For example, they were breeding in the New Forest in the 19th century, although heavily persecuted, very sadly, and from the 1940s. So it seems a little bit implausible that they weren't present in Sussex in some of that time anyway. So the survey work in Sussex was done initially in the 90s and 2000s by small group that did brilliant work. They found many nests, bringing many young. And from about 2007, I got involved with them, and I was then trying to improve coverage in the county, and that's something that I've continued to try to do. So how do you go about doing that? The first thing is you have to make a trade-off between secrecy and effort. And for very good reasons, honey buzzers have been subject to a lot of secrecy in the past and still are. But if you want to get full coverage of a large county like Sussex, you have to involve quite a lot of people. It's a tricky decision, and I certainly respect people who decide to maintain the secrecy. However, in Sussex, we have involved a larger team, certainly for the survey, and there were no adverse consequences of doing that. It's only beneficial in that we found more pairs than we would have done otherwise. We tried to get full county coverage, including, as I say, going to places where they've never been seen, and that was to some extent effective, although we certainly weren't able to cover the entire county. So what were the results of the work? Well, in the national survey, Sussex was found to have about 18% of the national population and 28% of the English population. And I'm going to show you a slightly busy slide here, I'm afraid, but if you can follow me, it's worth it, I think. So breeding pairs, that's the bottom green line, starting from 2000, but if you focus on 2009, 2010, we had 7 pairs in each of those years, and again 7 pairs in 2020 and 2021. And then in 2022, we had a record year with 10 breeding pairs. That dip in 2012, by the way, was a very wet year when only 1 pair bred. And then looking at the number of breeding pairs, including non-breeding pairs, that's the red line. You can see it shows a similar increase since 2012, in fact slightly steeper, and we had 15 pairs altogether last year. Then the brown line, that's all adults, and that's shown a pretty spectacular increase, going up last year to at least 55 adults present, and in fact the estimate was 55 to 65 adults. Now, surely this must be a genuine increase. Well, I'm not so sure. I think it could just be increased effort and using photographs to identify individual birds. But maybe it is an increase, and I will come back to that just in a moment. I also wanted to say on this slide that it shows goshawk territories, because goshawks kill adult and young honey buzzards, and it might have been the case that the tremendous increase in goshawks that we've seen in recent years in Sussex was correlated with a decline in honey buzzards. And as you can see, happily, that's not the case. So coming on to the question of whether there is a genuine increase taking place, just one thought I wanted to drop in. The area in Kent between the North Foreland and Dungeness is amazing for seeing honey buzzards coming in off the sea, including right in the middle of the breeding season, which I've taken as being between the 10th of June and the 20th of July. That picture top left there is a female coming in off the sea near the South Foreland on the 28th of June last year. And the Kent Ornithological Society have very kindly given me data from which I've produced this graph that just does show that there appears to be a genuine increase taking place, bearing in mind that these sites like Sandwich Bay, South Foreland, Dungeness are pretty well and consistently watched and have been for many years. So it may be that we've got these non-breeding adults coming in from the continent during the breeding season. Maybe some of them are coming to Sussex, and maybe some of them are returning in future years, or will return in future years to breed. So I think that's an interesting topic that could be worth further study. So what are our plans for this year and next year? Well, we're going to have a big team this year, can be split up into different groups covering different parts of the county. We hope to cover the entire county. That may still not be possible. How many birds will we find? I think 20 pairs is the upper limit. Be very excited if we found that many. We may find many less. Anyway, fingers crossed. And changing the subject slightly, we are going to publicise a few sites from 2024. And this is obviously tricky and controversial. There are risks attached. These are some of them. The ones I pick out in particular are actually the middle two. So badly behaved bird watchers alienating landowners. We know that this happens and it could happen, and we need to choose the viewpoints very carefully to minimise the risks and take other measures to minimise those risks. But the advantages are definitely there as well. The second one there, better data on status. From the point of view of this talk, that's perhaps the most important. But getting more people enjoying honey buzzards, gets more people interested in our wildlife, interested in the environment, interested in conservation. And there may also be a potential win in terms of our relationships with landowners. So we need to be careful, but that is something we're going to do. And I have spoken to the people who operate the honey buzzard watch points at Wycombe Forest and in Nottinghamshire as well. And I've also spoken to Mark Thomas of the RSBB's Crime Monitoring Unit and to Mark Eaton. And we think that this is the right way to go. I've consulted Hampshire and Kent Ornithological Societies. We've consulted our membership, and we're not getting pushback yet from anybody. Interesting. And I'm not going to talk about ringing, tagging, and nest studies, as I said, but I just wanted to say this is such an important way of getting information that field survey work can't get, particularly in relation to what's going on at the nest and breeding success and diet and feeding behaviour. And many young honey buzzards have been ringed in Sussex by Steve Roberts and his team, one or two by me. It's great fun and very safe, by the way. The research shows this is very, very safe. And one of the things that has been found is that birds move within Britain, within England at least, and between countries to breed. That really was quite exciting. So there was a male that was found breeding in the Netherlands in 2021 and had been ringed in Sussex in 2013. There it is, a lovely pale male. And we knew it had come from Sussex because of the ring on his leg that the photographer Edward Decker very, very professionally photographed. So there we are, with apologies to the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and the dolphins. So long, and thanks for all the wasp grubs. There's a juvenile honey buzzard on its way to Africa over the Straits of Gibraltar, and you can see that its wing shape is rather like a common buzzard, so it's often considered the most misidentified raptor in Europe. So thanks to many people who've helped me. Here are further sources of information if you want them. Do please contact me if you want some help with your field work. And big thanks to Steve Roberts in particular, and to Rob Clements, Mike Scott Ham, Dave Burgess, and other people who've helped with the honey buzzard survey work in Sussex. Thanks very much indeed. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Mark. That's a really amazing talk. I think you're just about to join us. Hi there. Hi there. Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. We haven't got any questions in the chat at the moment, but I spend quite a lot of time in the Brecks, actually, where I live in Thetford, looking for honey buzzards. We don't think we have them here yet. We quite possibly do. So I've been focusing my effort in August mainly. If you could add a few hills to the Brecks, that would be good, because we really suffer from a lack of vantage point, so it's incredibly difficult. So do you think August is my time where I should be putting the effort, or a bit later?
Yeah, I think from about the 10th of July to the 20th of August is certainly the peak time for confirming breeding. And there's some evidence that birds are breeding earlier now. So, for example, from Steve Roberts' work, we know that some females are laying eggs as early as the 20th of May, which is pretty remarkable considering that's when we thought they used to arrive. But yeah, they're getting earlier. So that time period is the best for confirming breeding. Okay, well, I shall keep at it. That's good. I just wondered whether your photography had given you any insights into survival, sort of, do you have any information on birds returning year after year and how old some of your birds might be? That's really Steve's field more than mine, but I think it does go into double figures of more than 10 years occasionally. One thing we do know is that the breeding success is extremely high. If you refer back to the paper by Roberts and Law in 2014, once the females have laid eggs, there's a very, very high breeding success rate.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Yeah, there's a couple of questions here, actually both relating to how vocal are breeding honey buzzards, adults?
They can be just very, very quiet, and you won't hear them unless you're very near the nest or a potential predator is near the nest, in which case you'll hear the whistling call, which is a bit like a common buzzard, but it's more of a whistle than a meow, I would say. But basically, you very rarely hear the call, and if you do, you may well be illegally close to a nest.
Okay, cool. And Chris is asking, do you think the non-breeding pairs are immature birds or birds deferring breeding? Yeah.
Yeah, again, I'm really deferring to Steve Roberts here, but his paper says that often they don't breed until they're between 3 and 6 years old.
Okay, cool. And probably final question maybe from Pete. What is the closest distance you've recorded between a honey buzzard nest and an active goshawk nest in your study area?
We don't know for sure, but it's probably a kilometre or a kilometre and a half. But bear in mind that goshawks would have fledged their young, so goshawk young could be self-sufficient before honey buzzard eggs have even hatched, which takes the pressure off a bit.
Okay, and just one final question. What is the best time of day for observing honey buzzard activity?
I would say from, if say you're in midsummer, from around 8 o'clock. A lot of people would start a bit later, but I'd start about 8 o'clock or even earlier, up to around midday or early afternoon. Certainly that sort of mid to late morning period seems to be best. But we know from camera work and tagging that they're active from sunrise to sunset. But outside that core periods of mid-morning, late morning, they're below the canopy, so you won't see them. Usually, there are exceptions. You can never say anything for certain with honey buzzards.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, Mark. There's a few more questions coming in now. We're going to have to move on to our last talk of the evening. So thanks very much for joining us tonight. Cool. Bye. So the final talk this evening is from Murray Orchard and Brian Watmer, and it's going to be presented by Murray. So Murray's originally from Kent and now living in Hertfordshire, and is a keen birder in both counties. And he's on the committees of both Herts Bird Club and the Kent Ornithological Society. He's chair of KOS Conservation and Surveys Committee. He's an avid surveyor, as I know Murray well. He's a BTO regional representative for Kent and an ambassador for Hertfordshire. Brian's also involved with BTO and is a heronry census regional organiser in Kent, and is the the KOS Red Breeding Bird Panel representative and deals with all the data. So thank you to Murray and Brian, and look forward to hearing your talk.
Good evening, everybody. Nice to be with you this evening to be able to talk to you on this 50th anniversary event for RBBP. And thanks to Mark for inviting me to be able to talk to you. I'd like to talk to you this evening about RBBP and providing the data from the perspective of us down here in Kent. It's not just me that's involved in RBBP down here. It's Brian Watmow, who's the RBBP rep, and I very much assist Brian. But Brian kindly allowed me to do the presentation this evening, so I'm here to talk to you. And I've got a late night slot. Hopefully there's a reasonable number of you still on call. So pour yourself another glass of wine, whiskey, whatever, and hopefully in the next 15 minutes or so be able to give you some interesting information about RBBP from a Kent perspective. So I've mentioned that Brian Watmow is the Kent RBBP rep, as you can see on the first slide here, who does what in Kent when it comes to RBBP. And Brian is very much the point of contact for most matters to do with RBBP records and putting together the annual report. So he's the sort of main point of contact. I'm chair of the KOS Conservation Surveys Committee, and that has a lot of overlap, obviously, with things like monitoring RBBP in Kent and other matters. So I have a lot of overlap with Brian. Barry Wright is our county recorder. So obviously we need to go to Barry for records, and particularly those species that are also BBRC records. So it's primarily Savage Water, I guess. And Robin Mace is the absolute lynch man. He's the county archivist, and he maintains our database and basically pulls everything together for us so that the whole process of RBBP can start. Just get my next slide. There we go. So Kent, are we an important county for RBBP? Well, despite the fact that we're sandwiched between London and the Channel ports, and we seem to have massive housing developments and new roads going on everywhere, and being in the sunny corner of the country, we've got lots of solar energy farms going up now as well. So there's massive threats to the county. But we still do have quite a decent array of RBBP species, as you can see in the slide here. I've highlighted the ones that I think are probably the Kent most important species. Obviously, turtle dove has been recently identified from the survey as showing that Kent is the #1 county for turtle dove in the UK. And we've got an estimated 700 pairs. Black redstart, 10 to 20 pairs quite typically each year, so that puts us somewhere around 25% of the UK population. Turtle dove was 33%. Pochard, we have probably around about 15 to 20% of the UK population. Lesser spotted woodpecker seems to be holding up. In Kent, we have an estimate of 150 to 200 pairs. Typically each year we report fewer than that, but basically we've probably got the second most biggest population of lesser spots in the UK, after Hampshire, I guess. And then medgull varies because of our habitats and the effects of spring tides and so on. We can have good years and bad years, but anywhere between 100 and 500 pairs of medgulls, which again puts us somewhere around 20% of the UK population. So you can see we've got some really big populations of RBBP species, and we'll typically report about 25 or so, and sometimes up to about 28 species each year in the report. And I couldn't not mention nightingale, which we're about to do a survey this year. We've got about 1,000 pairs in Kent, and that is also a reasonably useful population in terms of the UK. So where does the RBBP information come from? I expect this is probably similar to most counties, but you know, in Kent we have our own county database for reporting sightings, and obviously BirdTrack, increasingly eBird. Our reserves, we've got several RSPB reserves, and we certainly have good contact with our RSPB wardens to extract information from them reserves each year. The Wildlife Trust in Kent, unfortunately, I'll be careful what I say, but they don't do a lot of monitoring on their reserves. So unfortunately, we don't get any data really from the Kent Trust reserves unless people go in there and make observations and report to us. Two observatories, Sandwich Bay and Dungeness, they have fairly wide recording areas, and we get a lot of useful information from the wardens and their observatory reports. And of course, very important, individuals. You know, it's important to know your individual birders, those that really get around a lot, your very experienced top birders, because they'll know what's going on in all the far corners of the county, very often with including RBBP species. So having contact with them is paramount. Rigging groups can contribute some useful information as well, and increasingly we need to keep an eye on social media. A lot of stuff gets put on Twitter, WhatsApp, and we try to pull out what records we can from those sources. I guess the whole summation of all of this is networking. You really do need to tap into all the sources of bird information in the county that you can. So I would really stress things like making sure you have a good relation with your RSPB wardens and reserves in your county if you have them. Birders out there that you can sort of directly contact for information. Really is networking is the key thing to being able to make sure you get a reasonably complete set of information on RBBP. So moving on, how is the actual report produced? Well, again, I suppose this overlaps a lot with what other counties will do, but at the end of every year, Robin Mace, our archivist, will pull together all the records from BirdTrack, eBird and our own sightings database and pull that all together along with RSPB reserve data, which we get sent to us now automatically comes through from RSPB every year. We've managed to establish that. And that all gets summed up and Robin Mace then sends out data sheets to Brian and myself from which we can start to compile the RBBP report. At the same time, Brian and to an extent myself will contact those individuals and groups that we know might have useful information in order to get data from them. And then we divide the species. Brian does the majority. I do a few species that are of particular interest to me, sort of gulls, terns, waders. And then we start to put together the report from those data sheets that we've got and those other sources of information to put into the RBBP template. And it normally takes 2 or 3 spreadsheets to get all the Kent data in. So that's another reason for splitting the species. Brian normally fills up his, and then I sort of do my species in a separate spreadsheet. And then we have constant meetings during that process, or at least 2 or 3 meetings to make sure we know how it's all going, any difficulties, any difficult species, anyone who's not yet got back to us, that sort of thing. We'll sort of decide how to chase those things up. And then once the whole thing's drafted, I normally go through and check that it's all looking okay. So in particular things like, you know, are those sort of probable, possible confirmed species matching up to what we've given in the breeding codes and vice versa? And have we given all the location details, check the grid references? It's quite a lot to go through and check, but obviously I'd like to make sure that the whole thing is as accurate and complete as possible, so that we don't have to do too much corrections to stuff later on down the line. So I thought it'd be interesting to sort of pose just exactly what is an RBBP species as far as we're concerned in Kent, because if you went to a lot of bird watchers in Kent to say you need information on rare breeding birds, they'd probably think you were talking about a few species that are quite widespread in the UK, which are now sadly very rare in Kent. So I've put here a list of species that are now probably rarer than a lot of RBBP species in some cases in the county. I mean, grey partridge is now really limited in terms of wild population to a small population in the northeast of the county. Common snipe has now ceased breeding a few years ago. We don't have any common snipe breeding in the county now, but if there are any drumming birds, that'd be quite a rarity. Greater black-backed gull has just potentially recolonised, but certainly in terms of recent decades colonised the county. We've got less than 5 pairs. It's a really rare breeding bird. Marsh tit, interestingly, seems to be collapsing in Kent, and even some top birders doing work on lesser spots can't find marsh tits in most places, although they seem to be tripping over them next door in Sussex. So I don't quite know what's going on there, but we're really concerned about marsh tit. With lost wood warbler as a breeding species, grasshopper warbler, probably fewer than 20 species. We've recently lost common redstart. Until recently, there was just 1 or 2 pairs left in the county. Wheat tears, very isolated, just a few pairs down at Dungeness. Tree sparrow, we've got an isolated population on the Walham Marsh. Lesser redpoll, maybe just the odd pair in some of our western woodlands. So these are all species which are really, really rare breeding birds in Kent, but of course, in the rest of the UK, they're probably quite widespread species. But I just thought it'd be interesting, as I'm talking about things from a Kent perspective, to just highlight the fact that, in some cases, the RBBP species are actually a lot more common than some other birds that have got breeding in the county. So I thought it'd be useful to obviously talk about some of the issues that we have in Kent, which I suppose could be divided between species and the data process. The problem species are really those that are still quite widespread. So as a result, they are very under-recorded. So things like hobby and lesser-spotted woodpecker, which is still fairly widespread across the county, only get reported in a few sites. So we've got a dearth of records, but we know there's a lot more out there than get reported. So we're in that process of having to try and estimate population, which can get quite difficult. There are some super secretive species, obviously long-eared owl, very hard to find. Hawfinch, how many are there? Well, they're very hard to find now, and there are a few sites up on the downs mainly. And certain species are very difficult because of their habitat to actually see them and work out how many territories there are, like bearded tit. And we don't know quite what species are going to come onto our books to start recording, and which ones we're going to lose, of course. So we've got rid of a few species like firecrest and water owl that are quite common and pose a problem, but there might be other ones like that that come along in the future. The biggest issue in terms of data is really a lack of meaningful data now, increasingly, that we seem to sort of struggle to get from observers. Just not giving us breeding codes or any idea of what is going on in terms of the breeding side of things. So, what does 3 mean? Is that 3 birds flying over? Is it 2 males and a female? Is it a pair? What does it mean? So we're always appealing for better quality data to be sent in. Some of our RBBP reserve data is somewhat variable from year to year, so we have to sort of try and drill down there and work out exactly what's going on. And also, we find increasing problems with social media. I'll come on to that in the next slide. But also, we need to make sure that when we've got a lot of data together from these non-regular sources, that we make sure that gets back onto our county database, and that doesn't sort of slip the net there. So to finish with, I just thought I'd like to sort of go over some of the negatives and positives in terms of the future of RBBP in Kent. We've got 3 coastlines, so everybody wants to go to the good birding areas on the coast, and we have big problems of people not covering the inland areas, farmland and woodland inside the county. As I was just talking about social media, people increasingly put their records on WhatsApp, Twitter, instead of properly submitting records, which makes it increasingly difficult to pull together records. And finding volunteers generally to help with the whole process, whether that's helping with surveys, the process of collating records, processing data, widespread problem across the county, but that is an issue for us. But on the positive side, we've developed some really good networks, and we're able to sort of get data from a good range of sources now. Computers, mobile devices make the whole process of gathering data, of course, much easier, and organising surveys. Also, a lot of our RBBP species are actually not doing too badly. As I say, there's some other species that aren't doing so well at all. And as I've mentioned, anyway, that's the situation from a Kent perspective. So I'd be glad to take any questions that anyone has. Thank you very much. Thank you for listening.
Hi there, Murray. Thanks very much, and thanks to Brian for his input to the talk this evening. That's a fantastic example of teamwork, isn't it, across Kent? I'm sure you'll be the envy of many counties, all working together, and lots of different roles within KOS to help divvy up the work. So that's brilliant. Murray, I don't know if you wanted to give any plug for your Nightingale survey whilst you're here, and you might have a captive audience of how people can get involved.
certainly anyone who's likely to be around in Kent sort of during sort of April to May and wishes to assist, it's all up and running on a KOS website. You can go in there, see a link through to all the squares that we've got up for survey. That'd be really great to get as good a coverage as possible and see how things have changed since 2012 when the last survey was conducted. So yeah, please do take a look at what squares there are if you're able to, if you're in the area. Would love to have you help us with that survey. So yes, thank you for the opportunity to plug.
That's okay. And Paul's asking, or a similar sort of question really, any thoughts on why it's increasingly difficult to get observers to help with surveys? Do you find that in Kent?
Oh, very much. It just seems to be the general trend, doesn't it, now that so many more bird watchers now seem to be attracted to or continue to be attracted to the kind of general chasing the good birds, photographing good birds, and just not wanting to commit away from that the time to do especially surveys that have to be done perhaps within fairly narrow windows. It just seems to be that sort of lack of commitment. Maybe we're not getting the right approach to encouraging people to get involved. We try and use all the usual channels, of course, for communicating when we're doing surveys and so on. It's important to tell people why you're doing the surveys. So, you know, with the Nightingale survey, perhaps I should have said one of the reasons is because we have got huge pressures in Kent now. And if you don't do these surveys and find out what your numbers are, then you can't say that a particular site's got whatever percent of whatever number, because you don't know what the numbers are. So if you don't do the surveys, you know, you really are making it more difficult to stop some of those damaging developments that are going to affect areas that you wouldn't want to be damaged. So but yeah, it just seems to be that you know, there's still that draw away to the more sort of sexy kinds of birding, and getting people to do survey work is just seems difficult.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Murray. That summed it up nicely. Yeah, I think many birders don't realise actually how little the commitment is for surveys. So
yeah, yes, that's a good point. Yes, it's nowhere near as much as people sometimes seem to think.
Yeah, good. Okay, we're going to end it there. Thank you, Murray and Brian. Cool. So that brings us to an end for this evening. I hope you enjoyed the talks and the discussion. Very many thanks to our speakers, Mark, Marcus, Molly, Sarah and Ali, Mark and Murray, and of course Brian for their excellent talks. I hope this has encouraged you to check your notebooks, submit any outstanding records you have, and come a breeding season, remember to record the breeding evidence. So thank you very much to all our voluntary county recorders and the thousands of bird watchers. I think, you know, the last talk there just summed up how it all comes together and how the data feeds through to the panel. Big thank you to the funders of the Rare Breeding Bird Panel, RSPB, JNCC and the country agencies, and for BTO for continued support. I'd like to personally give a final thank you to Mark Eaton, who's put in a huge amount of effort into organising this anniversary conference. So thank you very much, Mark. And tomorrow evening, we're going to be doing the same again. And we have talks on Scottish Raptor Monitoring Scheme, red kites, spotted woodpeckers, rare breeding terns, and we'll hear about some of our rarest breeding birds. And I'll be talking about how we can use panel information to talk about some of the changing fortunes of our species. So thanks very much for joining this evening. I hope you've enjoyed it and look forward to seeing, well, not seeing you, but chatting to some of you tomorrow evening. So see you then.